All right, guys, I hope that was helpful. I hope that these 4 things help demystify the perspective grid a little bit in a way that helps you understand what's happening in real life, real photos, and also in a way that helps you just take control of your scenes so that your sketches can be clear and productive. To recap, the horizon line is not arbitrary. Vanishing points describe the field of view of an image, whether it's a wide angle or a narrow angle. And a subpoint to that is our vanishing points describe 90 degrees of a cube. So as long as you keep that in mind, you'll remember that whole concept of a field of view. The third one is that almost every scene should have a vertical vanishing point, right? The circumstances where our horizontal and vertical lines are perfectly horizontal and vertical are very narrow. As soon as we tip outside of a perfect center vertically or horizontally, we either gain vanishing points if we were in 1-point perspective, or we gain a third vanishing point above or below. And the fourth thing is that everything on the same grid shares the same horizon line and vanishing point. And when we change heading, our vanishing points, we get new vanishing points. When we pitch our bank, we get a fresh horizon line. Hey guys, Ruben Lara here, and today we're going to talk about 4 things to help you lose your fear of perspective. You know, for many artists, the whole concept of perspective is just scary, complex, and overwhelming. But it doesn't have to be. In fact, perspective can become a tool that's so useful and versatile that you can't imagine working without it. When sketching for a client or a project where multiple team members are involved and have to work together, sketches need to be 2 things: clear and productive. Clear sketches create accurate expectations, and they lay a successful foundation for whatever intention the sketch has in the future, whether that's a storyboard or an illustration or the basis for a photo session. And sketching productively is really important as well. Spend too much time on sketches and you just won't get that many done, and that can create frustration for the client, and it doesn't contribute toward a creative workflow. And this is where understanding and using a perspective grid will help us with both goals, clarity and productivity. At the beginning of a concept, clear perspective will help generate many ideas because they provide a framework for primitive shapes, which is how you're going to block out your scenes quickly. And toward the end of a concept, clear perspective will make images believable. And perhaps more importantly, it will make them executable. It's something that can actually be filmed or implemented in a real life photo shoot. Now, some people feel that using a perspective grid when doing rough concept work is just too constraining and it stops them from organically discovering ideas. And that can be true to a certain extent. And that's why how you use a perspective grid is really important. At the beginning of any idea, that perspective grid is just in your mind's eye, more likely. As the idea crystallizes and it gets approved by your client, or you for that matter, polishing that drawing on an actual grid or even using a digital perspective ruler will help turn it into something believable and executable. You'll start seeing perspective as an ally and not as an enemy. But it all starts with understanding a few super important principles that chances are, if you've taken classes on perspective but you're still frustrated with using it, you may not have completely understood yet. So I'm assuming you at least have a working knowledge of the basics, and you've probably at least heard of 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. There's a lot of really great lectures online, and I have some good recommendations on my website at rubenlara.com/perspective to get you started. So I'm not going to start from scratch, but if you know what a horizon line is, if you know what vanishing points are, and you know how to at least draw a 2-point perspective cube on a grid, well, that's good enough. The cube is the most basic primitive shape to master because it defines cages for all other complex structures that we're going to be putting on the perspective grid. So if we can understand and manage how cubes get drawn on the grid, we're on our way to controlling the grid and not letting the grid control us. All right, let's get started. Okay, our third point is that almost every scene should have a vertical vanishing point, tipping our scene into 3-point perspective. Now we say almost every scene because as we saw with our horizontal lines, they're only ever perfectly horizontal in a very narrow circumstance, right? Only when either the left or right vanishing point is in the dead horizontal center of our picture plane. So just to reiterate what that means is that as soon as we start rotating our box either to the left or to the right, our what used to be the perfectly horizontal lines have now gained a vanishing point, tipping them into angles and tipping us into 2-point perspective. Well, the same thing applies with our vertical lines. They're only ever perfectly vertical when our horizon line is vertically in the center of our picture plane. As soon as our horizon line as soon as our camera angle tips forward or backward, right, moving our horizon line up or down, we automatically gain a 3rd vanishing point. And let's see what that looks like. So I'm just going to go ahead and tip our camera down so we're looking down the scene. And notice what happens with those green lines. They're only ever perfectly vertical when our horizon is dead center or we're looking straight into the scene. So we're looking down. Now we gained a vanishing point at the bottom of our screen. We're looking up. Now those parallel lines become converge at a vanishing point at the top of our scene. So let's see what that looks like again. Perfectly dead center. In fact, I'll just go ahead and just zero this out again. Okay, perfectly dead center. If we rotate our box in the scene, we gain additional vanishing points. If we tip our camera down, we gain a 3rd vanishing point. And if we tip our camera up, we gain a 3rd one. If we tip it down, we gain a 3rd one as well. This is super important because this is what we often see artists do in pictures. So if we're grabbing so let's just reset this scene. Again, I'm going to do give ourselves a picture plane. Give ourselves a horizon line. And we're going to put this, maybe we'll say, okay, we're looking down in the scene and I'm doing the right thing by saying, I'm going to give myself 2 vanishing points like this, right here. We'll do one this way. Just make sure we're getting that nice clean horizon line. Okay, something like that. And coming up and saying, okay, well, I'm going to draw a cube, roughly down here. So let's give ourselves a couple more lines this way. Give ourselves some lines this way. And I'm saying, well, I'm just in 2-point perspective. So I'm going to do perfectly vertical horizontal lines. Perfectly vertical lines like this, okay? Which again is possible because we're drawing it. It's possible in a drawing, but is this really happening in real life? Well, no, because our horizon line is not in the vertical center of our picture plane. So what would this have to be more accurate? Well, because our vertical lines have now tipped up because our horizon line has now tipped up in the scene, we're forced to add a vanishing point down below us. So let's just go ahead and add that. And typically these are pretty far down the page. We're going to see what they look like in our 3D space, but I'm just going to exaggerate it just a little bit. Actually, let's make them a little bit less aggressive. Something like that, like this, right? Just kind of eyeballing it here. All right, now when I start doing this cube, we're going to get a much better sense that this is, in the correct perspective. It's very subtle, but having that third vanishing point, which sees and respects our horizon line being up in the scene, now gives us a much more believable cube. Let's go back to our 3D scene real quick, just to see the nature of that vanishing point. And I'm going to tip our box out to the 45s again. So we can see that even in a wide angle scene, right, because we're seeing both of our vanishing points inside the picture frame, we're at about 100 degrees here. It doesn't necessarily mean that our third vanishing point is that close to the picture plane. In fact, typically that third vanishing point is very, very, very distant. And it only starts really coming in close to the picture plane when we start tipping way down on our object. And in fact, that starts to become kind of like the single point perspective. But we're not going to get into that because it starts messing with our brains a little bit. But suffice it to say that typically our vertical vanishing points are very, very far off our picture plane into the distance, but they do add a lot to our scene. Let's go back to that 1-point perspective shot of our city to see how this relates. Now, when I originally drew this, I just went ahead and did straight up verticals for the sake of that section, because we hadn't introduced our third vanishing point yet. But even in this 1-point perspective scene, right, what appears to be 1-point perspective, there's a very slight vertical vanishing point happening because we already know that our horizon line is below the center. We're looking up in this scene. So let's delete what we did here and just reset this grid here like we had before. I'm going to find that nice 1-point angle. Okay, we've got our horizon line again. Now the way Clip Studio works is it always waits for a certain order of vanishing points. So left, right, or right, left, and then the third one has to be a vertical one. Because if we just set a vertical one here right now, it's going to assume that that's either the left or right, and it totally throws off our horizon line and tips it into space. So we want to kind of trick the grid into creating a second vanishing point and then making that parallel and then adding our third vertical vanishing point. So let's just do, it's kind of a fake second vanishing point here. So there's our 1 point, here will be our 2 point. And to set this as a complete parallel, all we have to do is hit the shift key before we change this angle. If we change this angle now, it's going to throw off our horizon line. So I'm just going to undo that. So again, I'll select our perspective grid. I'm going to hold down shift, and then I will start rotating this particular guideline, and you see it kind of disconnects it from adjusting the horizon line. So I'm just going to rotate this until it's completely horizontal. So now we have our 1-point perspective going down, right? Again, because we're in the horizontal center of our picture plane, it's that one little circumstance that allows our parallel lines to be completely parallel. Now we can add a third vertical vanishing point to finish off this grid. So I want to be careful which lines I'm using on the buildings, because even though these buildings are square, I want to make sure that I'm following an angle that is a true vertical on the building. We might have a building that has one cube as a foundation, and then it slowly kind of builds in. So I think I'm just going to use this wall right here. It's a pretty tall length. And if I hit shift, you can see that's my complete vertical. But if I let go of shift and kind of move to the right, we do see that what appears to be almost a complete vertical is tipping a little bit to the right, which is what we expect. And let's go to the complete opposite end of the picture, because that's where our angles are going to have the most variation, and then find a similar line that way. And I think this is a pretty good one. This going all the way to the top, and already I'm hitting shift, that's a complete vertical. I'm letting shift go, and it's tipping ever so slightly to the left. And sure enough, those two will converge into a vanishing point way off of our picture plane up in the sky. right? Very, very, very far away, as we'd expect, because that's the nature of vertical vanishing points. And also it's above us because we're looking up in the scene. Our horizon line is below the vertical center. And now we can, just go ahead and add some more drawings here. And we'll see that even though it's a very, very slight, our cubes are respecting this very, very subtle vertical point. And in fact, if I kind of do a line this way, we can see that it's subtle, but it's there. So adding that third vanishing point may not be something you do super early on. If we're just doing really rough concept sketches, maybe it's not super obvious, but you should always be aware of it. And even if it's a very slight, even in your early sketches, understanding when it comes into play, which is most of the time. There's very few scenarios and camera angles where a director may ask you for a dead center horizon line, both vertically and horizontally. That's the only circumstance, right? When your verticals and your horizontals are going to be perfectly vertical and horizontal. Most camera angles are either going to be rotated to the side, looking to the left, looking up, or looking down. In which case, you shouldn't be asking yourself, should I use 3-point or 2-point? You're always using 3-point perspective for all intents and purposes. Again, and this is going to make your sketches clearer, but also executable, a little bit closer to something that's going to be useful for a director shooting a scene or creating a storyboard that's going to be usable to the rest of the team. All right, the fourth thing we're going to talk about to just demystify the grid a little bit is this concept that everything on the same grid shares the same horizon line and vanishing point. Now, that may seem obvious, but sometimes people wonder, well, how do I rotate something on the grid? Do I use the same vanishing points? When I tumble something in space, what happens to perspective? And as soon as somebody tries to create a cube that's off the grid, it seems like everything falls apart. Well, let's talk about a couple of principles about what happens to objects that are off the main grid. I'm going to take our cube here, and I'm just going to duplicate it into a grid. So let's go ahead and I'm going to kind of separate these out, right? So now we have 3 cubes. Now don't be overwhelmed by the amount of vanishing point lines that we start to generate here. But we see that even though these 3 cubes don't exist in the same position, because they're all parallel, perpendicular to each other, we might say, they're all sharing that same vanishing point. And as long as they don't rotate or tumble in space, nothing will change about the vanishing points of all these objects. So I'm going to go ahead and add, 3 more this way, and let's just go for it and add 3 more vertically, right? So as soon as I kind of start moving these around in space, it doesn't matter where they are or how close they are to the camera or how far away we are from the camera. In fact, as soon as I start moving the camera, in and out, nothing changes about where those vanishing points are located. Why? Because they're all on the same grid. And in fact, if I tip my camera up and down in space, moving our horizon line up and down, nothing changes about those vanishing points. They're all on exactly the same grid. So now what happens to an object that goes off a grid, so to speak? Well, let's go ahead and remove our cloner effect here, and we'll move our box and kind of duplicate it. So now we have 2 boxes here. Now again, to reiterate, our second box is perpendicular or parallel to the first one. So our vanishing points are not changing as we just demonstrated in that grid, no matter how far or how close we go to our camera. However, once we start pitching this object in space or banking it in space, that object now starts getting its own horizon line. So we're just going to go ahead and rotate this and pitch it down. Let's get my controls here. So you see that as soon as we start pitching this object off the grid, now this particular object has its own set of rules and its own perspective grid apart from our original object. So you see that even its horizon line starts to shift. And if I bank it, then that horizon line will start to bank as well. Now again, did anything change about our scene? Well, no, these are just two cubes in 3D space. But we have to start deciding in our scene which is the object that's going to kind of have like the master grid. That's commonly referred to as our focal object or our focal point. So we might consider our first cube, right, to be our focal object, and then everything else needs to kind of play off of that master grid. It could be that our second cube, which is tipped, is our master object, and our first one is the one that's off grid. It really is how you want to see it in perspective in your scene. But it makes the most sense that the object that has the most consistent horizontal horizon line might be considered our focal object, and everything else has to kind of relate to it off on its own separate grid. But what we can continue to observe is that the secondary object that's off the grid of our focal object still behaves in all the same ways within its own perspective space. So for example, if I rotate this cube, you can see that it's doing the exact same thing as we've already considered in the other lessons. Its own vanishing points are just rotating around on that horizon line, you know, going behind our head for that matter. Here, now this is going into its own 1 point perspective. You know, maybe it's somewhere like around there. And of course it's off camera, right? So we're automatically getting that second vanishing point. But let's go ahead and move this, you know, to the center of our scene here. Let's see, that'll be 0. And let's just 0 this out there. And we'll go ahead and rotate him, you know, to some kind of 1 point perspective, which probably something like around there, right? So we can see that when its own object in its own separate grid system hits that 1 point perspective, what used to be our horizontal lines, which are now banked, they're all parallel to each other, right? But it's only in that one little scenario when this particular object is kind of dead center inside of its own perspective grid. As soon as it starts coming off that dead center, it's gaining the right vanishing point. As soon as it's coming off that dead center the other way, it's gaining its left vanishing point. And if this were, you know, kind of dead center vertically, that's when its verticals would be perfectly parallel to each other in its own space. Of course, remember we're banked here, but you see those green lines are just about perfectly parallel to each other. It's only that one little circumstance, because as soon as we start tipping it down, it starts gaining that third vanishing point vertically above its horizon line and vertically below its horizon line. So let's go back to some of our photos to see what that looks like in real life with some of our buildings here. So let's come to something that looks like, here's a great one. Okay, so the first thing we have to do here is pick an object that is going to represent our master grid, because everything, I mean, there's so many buildings here. I would say most of the buildings here have their own perspective grid. So this would be quite a complex village to draw in perspective. So let's go ahead and grab our perspective tool, and let's just go with this square little tower here in the foreground. So I'm going to hit 1 there. I don't have much to go off here, so let's just do something like that maybe. And we'll do the same thing here. This one has a little bit more of a drastic angle that I can find. And there we go. That's actually not bad. So we can see that we're looking down on the scene, right? Our horizon line is above center. And I think probably I'm going to, the one that was most problematic was this one. So I'm just going to adjust that so it's slightly straighter. Something like that. And that works. And I can always come to this one as well and just drop this down in the scene. Doesn't seem like it's so tipped. Just I had so little angles to go off of here that the margin for error is a little bit greater. Okay, let's discover if there's anything else in this scene that is on the grid of this particular tower. So I'm just gonna grab these lines now that our vanishing points are set and just kind of discover, you know, if any part of the city was built on this grid. Okay, well, its own building, for one thing. We can see that the footprint of this building matches the grid of this tower, because all of those are matching pretty well there. Anything else? Well, clearly not these buildings back here. Possibly this tall building in the back, just slightly off, but close to the grid. And that looks like a big, oddly shaped building back there. Maybe some of these buildings back here, you know, are on that grid. So if we looked at this as an aerial, right, we would see all these buildings basically having the same orientation as this tower. But now let's take something that's clearly not on that grid and see what its grid looks like. Now, we can assume that none of these buildings are pitched in space, right? They may be at different elevations, but because they're only rotated, only their heading has changed, we should expect that as we extract other perspectives from these buildings, the horizon line should be the same, because nothing is tipping in space forward or backward, and nothing is banking left and right. But everything is on the same horizon line, even though it has different vanishing points. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to leave that one up and just create another perspective guide here. So as soon as I make another line, it should give us another layer. So that's one. Actually, no, it is waiting for a third vanishing point. Let's go ahead and add that since we're talking about it. So let's do something like this and something like this. And sure enough, right, our vanishing point is down here, way down there. And if we look at this, we're at a very narrow angle. Our vanishing points are way off the picture plane. So we're applying all these principles that we talked about here, which makes even more sense that our vertical vanishing point would be so low in the screen. But it's a very subtle tip down. All right, I'm going to turn that off and let's get a new one. I think if I make a new one here, yeah, that'll give me a new one there. Okay, so let's extract these. Again, I have very, very small angles to work with here, so I'll likely have to just make some small adjustments to that horizon line, but it should be in that same general area. Okay, and I'm tipping that up. All right, so we extracted that one, and let's compare the two. Okay, pretty close. Again, our margin for error is really slim here. So let's go ahead and just adjust our second one. Let's just see what this does here a little bit. In fact, if I took this and just dropped this a little bit. Okay, now I'm getting confused. All right, let's take this. First, let's straighten it out. Okay, just straightening that out a little bit. And so that pretty much did it. We were able to kind of, see both of those grids at once, but we see that this grid and this grid are both sharing the same horizon line because these buildings have not tipped in space. The only thing that changed is their vanishing points, scooted over in the scene. So this is our original tower and this is our rotated building. And that's behaving very much like our cube does, right? So we have a certain set of vanishing points that are pretty close to the center. And as soon as it rotates around, and as soon as one of those vanishing points approaches that, kind of like that 1 point perspective, the other one shoots off way into the distance like we saw here. So the next question is, as an artist, am I expected to start drawing all of these perspective guides? How do I know how far off in the distance something shoots out? Well, the answer is it's very difficult mathematically to calculate it. And there are ways to take a protractor and measure the angles and rotate something in 3D space. But it's not very realistic to imagine that anyone would really be doing this on a daily basis, unless you're one of these brilliant YouTube guys, which I am not. So the answer is that a lot of it just comes from a gut feeling. And I know personally, the more I extract these grids, and I have to say, the more I extract them in Clip Studio, because it really lets me see where these vanishing points are, the more I extract grids from actual photos, the more my brain starts to record what happens in real life, with these different shapes. So that's my best recommendation, is take photos and extract as many grids as you can from real photos and just start seeing what happens in real life. And little by little, your brain will start to intuitively get a sense for how objects will rotate off the grid when building something. And when you see these really talented concept artists, creating villas like this in 3D space as a sketch, well, it's because they've been doing it so often and have enough observational experience that just intuitively they're starting to rotate, tumble, bank these shapes off the grid in ways that are believable. Of course, at the end of the day, we're doing a simple sketch, and likely we're not going to be creating blueprints for any kind of architecture, but we will be getting very close to something that's usable if it's a sketch that has to go into production. So again, what did we learn in this section? Everything on the same grid shares the same horizon line and vanishing point. Once something changes heading, which means it just rotates left and right, it gets new vanishing points, but not a new horizon line. Once something pitches or banks, it gets a new horizon line, even though its vanishing points in relationship with that horizon line don't change, right? Because it hasn't rotated at all. It's just tipping up and down. And of course, if something is banking, pitching, or changing heading, it's getting a new horizon line, it's getting a new horizon angle, and it's getting new vanishing points that are sliding around that horizon line. All right, the first thing that we need to remember is that the horizon line is not arbitrary or accidental. I'll often see artists start a sketch and just randomly place a horizon line in hopes that it will lead them to some kind of creative discovery. But the horizon line is one of the first cues as to what is happening in terms of the point of view of the person or the camera looking at the scene. To boil it down to two things, horizon line does not define altitude. It only defines if the viewer or the camera is looking up or down in the scene. Now, to understand that a little more clearly, let's head on over to my website at rubenlar.com/perspective. And I do have a section on this with a couple of helpful exercises. We're going to call this bird's eye view and a worm's eye view, which is something that is often used when talking about where to put the horizon line. Let's just read through this real quick. It's important to remember that the position of the horizon line does not depend on elevation, but the forward or backward tilt of the camera, or put simply, whether you're looking up or looking down. So when you're starting a sketch, the first thing you need to do is imagine yourself in the scene and determine where you are looking on the vertical plane, up or down. Then follow these simple rules. If you're looking straight ahead, the horizon line will always be in the vertical center of the composition. So we're talking about this vertical center, always in the center. That means that no matter how high you are in the scene, for both a street level scene and a scene looking out of an airplane window, the horizon line will be in the center if you are looking straight ahead. If you are looking up, we call that worm's eye view. Then the horizon line goes down the page. And if you're looking down, bird's eye view, then the horizon line goes up the page. So in the example below, drag the image up and down to shift from looking straight ahead to looking up and looking down. So both the street rat on the left and the airplane passenger on the right are able to both have a bird's eye and worm's eye view of their individual environments, even though their elevation from the ground is miles apart. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we see that our horizon line is right in the center of the composition because both the rat and the passenger are looking straight ahead. As soon as they look up, what happens at that horizon line? It goes down the page. So again, the elevation or the altitude of the camera isn't what's dictating the horizon line here. It's whether that camera is looking up or looking down. So as soon as we look down the page, the horizon line goes up the composition inside the picture plane. So here's something you can practice. Just take your pencil, hold it out, and I still do this down to this day because once it becomes just instinctual, it helps me remember in the scene. Helps me remember where to put that first line in the scene. So I'll hold my pencil out and decide, am I looking up or looking down? So the pencil is going the opposite direction of my gaze, up and down. So immediately I'll start on the blank page and just hold my pencil out. Yeah, I'm looking up in the scene. I know my horizon line is going to be at some point below the vertical center of that picture plane. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of practical examples of this in an actual 3D scene. So I'm hopping over to my 3D program here, and I just have a really simple city type model here with a camera. The camera, as we can see, is looking straight ahead. So I have the ability to look up and look down, just like if we were looking up and down in our scene. So right now it's straight ahead, and let's go ahead and look through this camera. And we can see that the horizon line, this little gray line here, is right in the vertical center of our composition because we're looking straight ahead. I'm just going to take this camera and imagine that we're going up in an elevator up into the sky. So we're going now up all the way up into the sky. Well, what is happening with that horizon line? The answer is nothing. It's staying in the vertical center of the screen because our camera is looking straight ahead. So no matter if we're on the ground plane or if we're way up in an airplane, our horizon line doesn't change. The only time it will change is if we now tip our gaze down or up. So I'm going to adjust the pitch of this camera, which is the forward tilt. And now, as soon as I look down, the horizon line is going up the page. And as soon as I look up, the horizon line is going up the page. I'm resetting this back to 0, so we're looking straight ahead. And let's go back to the street level. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm looking down to the street. The horizon line is going up. I'm looking up into the sky, and the horizon line is going down the page. So hopefully this will just reinforce in our mind that the position of the horizon line does not depend on altitude. It depends on the forward or backward tilt of the camera. All right, now let's see how we can get this same sensation or effect when we're moving around on a perspective grid. So I'm heading back to my website, and at the bottom, you can click this link, rubenlara.com/perspectivegrid, and it will take us to a perspective grid generator that you can move around, play around with, take a screenshot, and put it into any of your favorite drawing apps. I'm just going to go here to the loose grid, so we have a little bit fewer lines. And all I need to do is now drag this around the screen to just play around with where this horizon line is in my picture plane. So right here I'm at the center, and again, we're looking straight ahead, so nothing's happening with the horizon line. We're at the vertical center, and as soon as I want to look up in my scene, I just simply drag it down. So we're looking up, and now we're looking down. You already get a sense from the way the vanishing point grid lines are converging. We can imagine a cube, up here in the distance, looking up in the sky, and as we kind of go down, our cube, we'll start seeing the top faces of those cubes. So here we'll be seeing the bottom faces of those cubes, and now the top faces of those cubes. Now the way this particular interactive grid is set up is that our vertical vanishing point automatically adjusts depending on whether we're above or below the horizon line in our picture plane. We'll talk about that on another point. But the takeaway point here is where the horizon line is in relation to our view. Okay, let's do one more exercise to really drive this point home, and let's see how this plays out in real life in actual photos. So I'm heading over to pexels.com, which is free stock photography, and I'm just going to type in buildings. And let's pull out a few examples here that will help us get a sense of where that horizon line is. Okay, here's a good one. And I'm starting off with an easy 2-point perspective grid, just so we can get a sense of where the perspective's at. I'm going to copy this image. All right, now here I'm using Clip Studio, but you can use your software of choice. And you'll see why I prefer Clip Studio for perspective work, just because of some of the perspective tools that come with it. So the first thing we want to do is find out where the vanishing points are in this image, and that's going to tell us where the horizon line is. Again, these are just some really basic perspective exercises here. So I'm going to reduce the opacity of that a little bit. I'll give myself a new layer I'll just grab something simple like my rough pencil. And all we need to do is find parallel lines in the scene that describe a cube so that we can get our two vanishing points. So I immediately gravitate toward this table and these windows, which appear to be squared off to each other. And here's a parallel line and here's a parallel line. And also, here's a parallel line, here's a parallel line. And we have the same things in the window. So all we need to do is kind of trace those out into the distance to find out where the vanishing point is. So I'm going to put a line here. I'm going to hit shift and draw that out onto the distance. I'm going to do the same thing here with the table. And we'll draw it out this way. And we'll draw it out this way. Now, if the table and the windows are roughly on the same grid, that means that these lines should also be hitting that same vanishing point. Now, here's where we run into problems with most digital software, is that we can't draw outside of the canvas area. And so it's very difficult to discern where the vanishing points are in our image. I have to kind of imagine where this line is heading out and maybe guess that it's somewhere around here, and then guess that it's somewhere around here and decide that's about where our horizon line is. So that's like my best educated guess. But even at this guess, I'm already getting a sense of where the camera, what that forward tilt of the camera is here. Because we already said that if the horizon line is above the vertical center of this picture plane, then our camera is looking down. So even with this really basic vanishing point extraction, we can already understand one thing about this picture. We're looking down on this scene, even though, we're up maybe at the third or fourth floor of this building. Let's take a look at another example. Now I'm gravitating toward photos that have at least one or two elements that are squared off to each other on a grid. We're going to talk a little bit more about rotated elements on the grid later, but just for the sake of this exercise, it will help us to just not be confused by other things here. So I'm going to copy that image, drop that into a new scene here. Now, instead of using our pencil to extract a grid, let me introduce you to some of Clip Studio's perspective tools. Those are found in the ruler section, and all you need to do is open up your subtool palette and find your perspective ruler. So I've grabbed that and I've dragged that out onto my command bar for easy access. Now, the way the perspective ruler works is that it expects you to place your left and right vanishing points on the horizon line first, and then any vertical ones can follow after that. So let me just turn this layer off real quick to show you how that works. So I'm on the perspective tool, and I just click and drag to establish the first angle of one of my vanishing point lines, and then it waits for me to put a second one down before establishing that as a vanishing point. So as soon as I click and drag and basically determine at this point arbitrarily where that vanishing point is going to be, I let go, and it automatically gives me a horizon line with one vanishing point. Then I can continue using the same tool if I'm on the same layer that the perspective ruler was created on, and I'll just start adding 1 and 2. You can see it already wants to snap to that horizon line, and as soon as I let go, now I have a horizon line with 2 vanishing points. And that means that if I'm on that layer or another, this grid is now enabled, and any line that I draw is now snapping to those 2 vanishing points. And can I always change the location of those vanishing points? Clearly that would change my drawing by just using the object tool, and I can just drag this around. I can alter the pitch of that horizon, or I can grab these little handles as well to kind of scoot that vanishing point way off the page. So each one of these vanishing point grid lines has a couple of controls. The little white one just moves this perspective ruler guide around this vanishing point, whereas if I grab the blue handles, it will actually scoot that vanishing point off into space on the horizon line. The same control applies to the horizon line. I can move this left and right. And already with the principles we've already talked about, we can start getting a sense of whether we're looking up or down the page again, right? So if I'm in the center, I'm looking straight ahead, and I'm looking up the page, and I'm looking down the page. So we get that same sensation. And of course, each one of these guidelines has the same controls. I can grab this little arrow here to move the whole perspective grid around, and I can also disable certain lines. For example, if I only want the pencil to respect the left vanishing point but not the right ones, I just click this little diamond and it turns green. And so now when I'm drawing my lines are only snapping to that left one, but not the right one. So just a lot of little controls for that perspective grid. But the reason why it's super powerful in this case is because we can see the vanishing points off the canvas, which is going to be really helpful as we extract a grid here. Okay, so that was the basics of the grid. Let's go ahead and turn on our image, and let's use our perspective tool to extract the grid from this particular scene. So I'm going to find our common parallel lines in the scene. So here's a clear one, and then here's a clear one to me of the Citibank building in the back. So I'm just going to click and drag and establish that first one. And let's find another one. We'll click and drag and establish that one. So already, even with our first vanishing point, it's already telling us that the horizon line is way underneath the picture plane. And that's okay, right? Because that horizon line can just dip way below. But the important thing is that it's below the vertical center of our picture plane. That means we're looking up at this scene, which is pretty obvious because that's what's happening in these buildings. Now we don't need the right one at this point to determine where the horizon line is, but let's just go ahead and extract it anyway so we can see how that works. So I'm going to do one there, and I'll find another one that's far enough away. I always find it just becomes a little more accurate. And so if we needed to draw anything else on the scene, now all of our drawings are going to match with the perspective of this camera. Of course, we need one more third vanishing point in this. Now that we've established our left and right, let's just go ahead and add it while we're at it here. So here's a vertical there. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to put one there and just undo it because I didn't quite hit it. All right, there's one there, and let's just go all the way to the other side and find a nice clean vertical here. And we can see now that we've added our third vanishing point. We're going to talk about that in another hint in this series. But now, if I go ahead and I wanted to, put an additional shape way up in the sky here, get a nice small pencil here. We're getting exactly the same perspective from our buildings. And we can just, really start having fun here and just start adding, elements or, making this building taller or whatnot. So there we go. The takeaway from this image is that we're looking up at this scene. Let's check out one more. Okay, I'm just going to reduce the opacity of this, give us a layer, use my perspective tool, and just find some pretty consistent enough parallel lines in the scene. So I'm going to assume that all of these bricks are on the same plane. So there's one there, and let's see. This looks pretty consistent there. Okay, so there's our horizon line, and I can test out to see if I've kind of hit the correct parallel planes here by just grabbing any one of these guides and then rotating them around in the scene. And so as I rotate them around, I can just test and see, okay, that was pretty spot on. I'm hitting, all of these parallel edges, and wow, these old buildings were amazingly built and accurate on a grid, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so now that we have that, we can start making some deductions about the scene. So it looks like our horizon line is pretty close to the center. That means that someone just kind of walked up to this woman, put the camera up at eye level, and snapped a picture. If we were to move it one way or another, it's just slightly above the horizon line. So that means they were slightly looking down. Maybe this photographer was a little taller than she was. And so to get her in the plane, he just put that camera like this and then just went slightly down, right? Because that horizon line is above the vertical center. Now let's just keep scrolling through that list of photos and see if we can just visually identify looking up or looking down in each of these photographs. So I'll keep coming down here. For example, this one here, well, clearly we're looking up because we're looking up at these buildings, but we can prove that by just, in our mind's eye, tracing these vanishing points down to their origin, and this is where the horizon line would be. So we're looking up in this particular case. Let's take a look at this one. Well, this one has an actual horizon of the planet Earth, but if we traced out these lines all the way up, they would end out roughly around here, because that's how real life works on our planet. So even though we're up in the sky, we're looking down at the city because our horizon line is above the vertical center. All right, here's another one with a pretty clear horizon, but it's just below the center. So that means we're looking slightly up into the sky. Looking up. Of course, a lot of these with buildings are pretty straightforward because they have pretty clear horizons as is. But let's take a look at something like this. All right, if we just trace in our mind's eye, these are coming down, this is coming up, they converge around here. So in this case, the cameraman was maybe crouching on the ground and then tilting that camera up to get this this shot. Okay, here's a good one. Here we have a street that's not on the grid, but we do have some items that are parallel somewhat to each other. So if we take these parallel lines and draw them straight out, our horizon line is roughly around here. Now that is pretty much in the vertical center of the composition, I would say. So this cameraman is just looking straight ahead, to get these two figures right in the center. And so we're close to not looking up or down in this particular composition. So what does that mean in practice? Let's head on over to a blank page here. Well, it means that as soon as we sit down to draw a sketch, that's the first decision we want to make. Imagine, close our eyes in the scene and imagine, am I looking up or down at whatever the focal object is? Now, this also implies that we may need to start adding another element that you likely are not using when you're sitting down to sketch a scene, and that's a picture plane. Because if I go here and let's say I'm sketching out various concepts and I'm doing one here and I'm just like brainstorming out ideas. Well, how can I possibly go and just start drawing out a scene here and say, okay, well, here's my horizon line. Well, the horizon line has to be made in relation to something or else it's meaningless. It has to be done in relation to a picture plane. So if you haven't been doing so already, start adding picture planes to your concept sketches. Even if that sketch is going to be a vignette at the end of the day, having that picture plane is just going to allow you to make that first decision. So in my quick access bar, I've extracted Clip Studio's rectangle tool, so I always have it available to me. So let's say I'm going to make a concept here, and I'm going to make another one here, and another one here, and another one here. So I'm just roughing out ideas. Now I'll give myself a new layer here. And now I can start making decisions about this scene. So just take a simple scene like a box of cereal on a table, on a dining room table. So I'm saying, okay, here's my horizon line. Get a straight horizon line there. And I want to, and I'm imagining it in my head, and I'm like, okay, I'm looking down at this table. So all I'm going to do is drag this horizon line up the page because I'm looking down at the cereal box. I'll give myself a couple of rough vanishing points there, something like this. And just kind of start drawing out this cereal box, right? So maybe something like this. And maybe it's on the corner of a table. And I'm not drawing an architectural blueprint. I'm just roughing out a concept here. And of course, these vanishing points are quite extreme, so we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But for now, we'll just do something like this. And let's say there's a coffee mug here. Remember, we talked about this idea that cubes are the cages for everything. So even before drawing a coffee mug, I'm going to want to draw that cube and decide, oh, that looks more like a rectangle. All right, there's my cube there. All right, there's my coffee mug. And now I can, just kind of keep going back in space to figure out where all that stuff is. And now I'm making another concept, and now we're looking up at this cereal box. So let's get another layer there, starting in the center. From looking up, right, my horizon line is going down, looking up. And let's go ahead and get a couple more vanishing points, and this time we'll maybe pull them out just like this a little bit more, something like this. Okay, and this time we are, and by the way, I'm clicking the numbers on my keyboard, 10%, 1 for 10, 2 for 20, etc. So now let's look up at this cereal box, and so we'll just kind of do something like this. Pretty rough idea here. Up the table, and this table is kind of doing that, and put our coffee mug again, get that cube down. Maybe that's a little bit taller. Again, just roughing out ideas, but even at this early stage, we're kind of able to hop in here and get a realistic sense of what's happening with these shapes. Again, we'll refine these later, with a better grid, a cleaner grid. But already, if I'm working with a client concept here, I want to give him 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different ideas, right? So that they can make decisions about what this shot's going to be. And so what I'm doing here is exploring camera angles and exploring points of view in ways that change the story. In this first one, we have a little bit more control and dominance in the scene because we're taller than the subject at hand. Maybe we're looking at the thing. Whereas in the second one, it's maybe a little bit more of an imposing view. Well, that's a topic for a whole nother discussion about what camera angles can do for a scene. But the point is that you want to give your client or whoever's directing you that kind of variety in scenes as quickly as you can at the rough concept stage. Now, are we using a perspective grid? Absolutely we are, but very loosely, like we talked about at the beginning, in our mind's eye. It's not constraining our creativity, in a way that's making things too stiff. It's actually helping us discover and explore, what this scene is doing. So I hope that helped to reinforce the first point, is that the horizon line is not arbitrary. It does not define altitude. It defines looking up or looking down in the scene. All right, the second important thing to know about perspective is that our vanishing points describe the field of view of an image. Oftentimes, a director or a client will tell an artist, okay, in this shot, I'm looking for a wide angle or a narrow angle of the scene. And there's just giant question mark in the gaze of the artist. Like, I have no idea even what that means or how to draw it. So that's what we're going to talk about. The terms wide angle and narrow angle refer to how much of 180 degrees we can see in our picture plane. So if you stretch out your arms and you look straight ahead, in your peripheral vision, you can just get a sense of where your left hand and your right hand is. Even though you can't focus on it, you have a very wide peripheral vision of 180 degrees. Now, most pictures or most photographs aren't showing us everything to our left and everything to our right. Some cameras can do that, like a GoPro and an action camera. They have a pretty wide field of view. But most cameras are only capturing a segment of that 180 degrees. Maybe it's half of that. So half of 180 is a 90. So if we kind of bring that into a corner, and if we say that this image has a field of view of 90 degrees, that means that everything outside of, from 0 to 90 and from 270 all the way to 360, right, is outside of the picture frame. We can't see it. Sometimes a camera will have a field of view of 20 degrees. Now we're starting to get into a very narrow field of view. So we're talking about wide angle, a lot of the 180 degrees, or narrow angle, a little bit of that 180 degrees. Well, that reminds us that our vanishing points are describing 90 degrees of a cube. Let's take a look at that in our 3D perspectives here. So here I have a basic camera, and I'll just pull out of the scene. It's just a cube with some lines that represent the parallel edges of each one of the cubes, and I have a camera just looking straight at it. And with this camera, we can go ahead and pitch up and down. All right, so we already talked about horizon line. We're looking down on the scene. We're looking up on the scene. Just reset this to 0 again, and I can change the heading, looking left and looking right. But as you can see in this scene, both vanishing points are well within our picture plane. So that means that the field of view of this particular camera is greater than 90, right? Because the vanishing points are describing the 90-degree angle of this cube, and they're inside the plane. So I'd venture to say that if this is 90, then our camera is somewhere around like 100 degrees or 115 or 120. Well, let's take a look. let's select the camera, and I'm going to come here to object. And actually, this one is set at 100. So field of view, horizontal, 100 degrees. Now this has an equivalency in an actual physical camera. As it says here, 35 millimeter equivalent focal length is 15 millimeters. So I know we're diving down a little bit into some photography, but I think it's really important for artists to understand what relationship does their sketch have with a physical camera, because that's what most of sketching for production needs to be aware of. Let's go ahead online and take a look at a chart, a field of view table chart. So there's tons online. This is one I found here, Nikonians.org. And again, every camera has slightly different values, so these are just in general. But you can see that the first column says lens focal length, and then it says 35 millimeter field of view, angles in degrees. So if we're talking about a field of view of 90 degrees, that means the camera we're using is 18 millimeters or around there. So if we come here and change this to 90 degrees, let's see what, and as soon as I hit enter, watch what happens to these vanishing points. You see how they exactly hit the edges of my picture frame? That's because now I've set the camera so that my field of view is exactly 90 degrees. I'm not seeing more than that 90 or less than that 90. And sure enough, my 35 millimeter equivalent focal length is 18 millimeters. Let's go towards something that has a wider field of view, something maybe like a GoPro camera or something like that. So I'm just gonna go travel down this chart and, up the chart into larger field of views, which is our smaller millimeter focal lengths, and to this 121 degree field of view, 10 millimeter camera lens. So let's just go up. So let's just like 120, right? 121. So now we're seeing in the picture frame is that not only are we seeing the 90, but we're seeing much more, of that 180 degrees. And sure enough, we're at a 10 millimeter camera lens. Now let's go ahead on over to narrow fields of view. That means that we're going to be seeing less and less of that 180, and in fact less and less of that 90 even of the objects in our scene. So going narrow and narrow and narrower, down to maybe like a 20 degree field of view, and that's equivalent to about 102 millimeter camera. Let's just go ahead and confirm that. So yeah, 20.4, 100 millimeter camera roughly. But what does that mean in practice? Well, I'm going to go ahead and make our window a little bit smaller here so we can start seeing what's happening. And I'm going to have to pull out of my camera in space so we can see now our box. And you can see that our vanishing points are now way off the picture plane, right? Because our field of view is super narrow. And I'm just going to try to go as small as I can. And there we go. You see one vanishing point is out here and the other one is way out here, symmetrically. But now what this is telling us is if we take these 2 points, remember those 2 points represent 90 degrees of our 180 degree arc. And if that's 90, right, then 180 has to be at least double. And the way the degrees on a protractor work, the further you get out to the edges of the degrees, whether it's 1 degree or 79 degrees, those distances really start to expand quite a bit. So that means that if we were able to see all 180 degrees left and right, the 1 degree and 179 would be way off even the screen. But that's the nature of a very narrow angle, because according to what we're seeing here, we're only seeing 20 degrees of that 180. And that creates a couple of different effects in our perspective scene. First and foremost, our vanishing points or our parallel lines start to become less aggressive in relationship to each other, right? So we can already see that this box, and in fact, let me just tip the camera down a little bit. So we're looking down, horizon lines going up. We can see that the parallel lines are appearing more and more parallel the narrower we become in our angle of view. Whereas as soon as we start going to larger and larger field of views or angle of views, and we start kind of zooming into this scene, our vanishing point angles become much more aggressive in relationship to each other. So what do we learn from this? We learn that if we want to start our image with a wide angle of view or wide field of view, then that means that our vanishing points have to be pretty close to the picture plane, or sometimes inside that picture plane. right? Wide angle of view, we're seeing a lot of that 90 degrees, if not more. And if we want to have a narrow angle of view, then our vanishing points need to go way off into the distance off the board, because we're only seeing just a little bit of that 180 degrees, and our perspective becomes much less aggressive on the page. Let's go back to our photos and take a look at what's happening in real life. All right, here's a good example. I'm going to copy this image, head back to Clip Studio, and let's just go ahead and extract our perspective grid again. So let's take our left lines and we'll do something like that. Okay, so we're pretty much looking almost straight out, right? It's not so much above the horizon, so we're not looking too much up or down. All right, now we want to get our right one going off in the distance, so let's find pretty solid lines here. So let's take something like this. That looks pretty stable. And let's take something like this and go off into that distance there. Okay, so there we go. Now we're just going to evaluate this image in relation to its picture plane, because it could be that the photographer took a picture and then recropped it. So we don't know exactly what focal length this particular camera was, because we don't know what the crop was in this particular page. But if we're evaluating this picture solely on this crop, we can see, what can we see? Well, if we take a look at our two vanishing points. Now remember, our two vanishing points represent 90 degrees, and they're pretty close to the edges of our picture plane. So we're seeing our fair share of 90 degrees in this image, which is approximating more of a wide angle shot. So as soon as these vanishing points start to get next to the edge of the picture plane, and we're seeing a lot of that 90, those shots can start to be considered, wide angle. If this was a narrow angle shot, then these vanishing points would be, way off the grid. So if you can just remember those two things, if vanishing points are near, the closer the vanishing points get to our picture plane, the edges of the picture plane, the wider the angle is. And we can kind of get a sense of that, right? When we're looking at it, the angles, the parallel lines that make up these cubes are pretty aggressive in relation to one another. And that's the nature of these wide angle shots. We're seeing a lot, or a good amount, of that 180 degrees. Let's take a look at another one. All right, extract again. 1, let's get something nice and far away. 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so we're clearly looking up in this scene because the horizon is low. Our two vanishing points are pretty close to the edges of the picture plane, so I would say we're approaching a wide angle shot. We can see that again because the parallel lines of our cubed cages are pretty aggressive in relation to each other. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Now this one's going to be a little trickier, right? Because of our angles aren't so aggressive. This is already telling us that we're approaching more of a narrow angle shot. So let's just find some horizontals here that we can extract. So there's one, and let's try this one there. Get a little bit of the angle. Okay, so already we know we are looking up. Our camera is looking up in this scene. And let's get our other side here. We'll say 1, and this is a pretty nice one right there. 2. Okay. So now let's see what's happening with our vanishing points. If I go ahead and select our perspective grid here, they're much further away from the edge of our picture plane. So now we're getting this sense that if these two dots represent 90 degrees and 180 is, another, 2.5 times that, at least in our protractor degree measurements, well, we're only seeing a very tiny bit of this 180 degrees. So that means we're at approaching a narrow angle shot. Okay, now in this case, I can see that my horizon line is super tilted, and it's probably because I didn't set this up. You know, I didn't have this line exactly correctly on the angle of this building. But now that I adjust it a little bit more, I'm gonna just drop this a little bit. That makes a lot more sense for that horizon line. And sure enough, if there was no fog in that city, this would probably be a little bit more visible in the distance. But again, we can tell a couple things. We're looking down because the horizon line is up in the page. And here, one of our vanishing points is actually inside the picture plane and the other one is out, right? But what we're seeing is that we're looking at, you know, if we were to scoot these over, let's just go ahead and do that. If we were to scoot these over a little bit, like we're kind of just moving, you know, rotating our head to the right, we can see that these two vanishing points are creating an image where most of our image is seeing a lot of that 90 degrees. So again, we're around or approaching a wide angle lens for this particular shot. Let's do one more. Let's go ahead and tackle a 1-point perspective dissection here. Coming out here to Clip Studio, dropping it up. Okay, so the tricky thing with 1-point perspective is we need 2 vanishing points to get a sense if this is a wide angle or a narrow angle, except with 1-point perspective, we only have this single vanishing point that's gonna go right down the center. Well, let's go ahead and put that on anyway. So I'll just reduce the opacity, get our perspective tool, and let's find some nice stable angles here. So there's one there, and let's do this one here. That's something like that. I think that looks pretty good. I'm gonna grab my object tool, grab one of these grid lines and kind of just bring it around the scene to see how accurate I am. Yeah, that's matching there and matching there, matching these windows here pretty well. All right, I think that's pretty good. Okay, so there is our 1-point perspective grid. Now again, like we mentioned, you need 2 vanishing points. I shouldn't say you need 2 vanishing points, but it's easier to tell if an image is narrow or wide angle with 2 vanishing points. But we only have the one here. So something we should know about wide and narrow angle shots is that narrow angle shots are usually so zoomed into a scene that we see very little of the environment. So because we see so much of the environment here, we can assume that we're approaching a wide angle lens on this particular shot. If it was a narrow angle, we'd basically see, you know, only a little bit of this perspective grid. So when we think about it from this perspective, we can see that there really is only one perspective grid. The width of our angle, whether it's a wide angle or narrow angle, is just determining how much of that grid we're using. So let's go back to our perspective grid generator here. And the way it's set up right now, what can we tell about this shot? Where we're looking straight ahead, we're seeing more than 90 degrees of field of view. So we're definitely at a wide angle shot. But as I just scroll my mouse wheel zooming in and out, as I zoom in closer and closer and closer to this grid, we can imagine these 2 vanishing points, you know, going off my screen, getting further and further away from the edges of my picture plane. We're now starting to get into a narrow angle grid. Now I didn't change anything about the grid, I just zoomed into it. So that's an important concept to kind of think about when you're working in perspective. There really is only one perspective grid. The question is how much and what part of that grid are you using is going to dictate how far these vanishing points are away from our scene. So again, if I zoom out, now we're doing a wide angle. Now it's a very wide angle. And the further I go, the more of this 180 degrees we're going to see in our grid. So wide angle and narrow angle. Let's take a look at that from another perspective here in our 3D camera. I'm going to go ahead here and let's drop this down back to a field of view of like 100 again, something that's just a little bit less drastic. Maybe something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom out. Just kind of get a little bit away from this camera, and we'll just kind of reset our view so that we're looking straight ahead again. Now I'm going to take this box and let's rotate this box in 3D space to just see what happens to its vanishing points as they rotate around. So here we're seeing the corner of the box, again, clearly left and right vanishing points. Now as soon as they start rotating this box, we can see that the vanishing points start moving off our picture plane in either direction. So if we're straight at that 45-degree angle, you can see here our box is at 45. We have even vanishing points on both sides. And now as soon as I rotate that box, the left one starts to go off screen, off screen, off screen. And let me just make our picture plane a little bit zoomed out here so we can see. Now we're going to get to a point where that left vanishing point actually turns into a complete parallel line. So I'm going to go right to 90 degrees. And now we're at a 1-point perspective in our scene. Well, did anything really change about our scene or our camera? No, it's just the orientation of the object in relation to us. We can also see that what we think of as a 1-point perspective scene only applies in a very, very small set of circumstances. It only happens when this cube is directly perpendicular to our line of sight. Because as soon as I rotate this cube 1 degree either way, we automatically gain a left or a right vanishing point. So I'm going to bring this back to 90, and we have complete parallel lines for what used to be our left vanishing point. And let's just increase this to 91 to rotate it, more to the left. And you can see as soon as I move 1 degree to the left, our horizontal lines are no longer parallel, and we've gained a right vanishing point. And that vanishing point will slowly come into our picture plane as we approach 45 degrees. So either way, this is where we were at. And you can see as I rotate this box around and around, it's just that these vanishing points are just rotating around our field of view for all intents and purposes. Now, technically, they cease becoming a vanishing point when they're perfectly parallel. But that only happens, again, when the box is at a clean 90 degrees or 0 degrees for that matter. So 0, 90, right, 180. These are all snapping to the 90s where that horizontal vanishing point ceases to exist for that one little moment. But as soon as we add 1 more degree, we're getting that vanishing point. It's super important to understand this because here's what we see oftentimes artists will do. So let me just get another drawing here. Get our picture plane and horizon line. And they're saying, okay, I'm going to do a 1-point perspective shot here. And my single point perspective is going to be right here. So everything's going to go off this grid. Just line up here. Right. So then they go ahead and start drawing. And they start drawing a box that looks like this. And then they start drawing a box that looks like this. And they're saying, well, it's just 1-point perspective. So all my verticals and all my horizontals are perfectly, perfectly vertical and horizontal. Okay. And while this might be true, in theory, because I'm clearly drawing it like this, it's possible to draw. Is it really what's happening in real life? Well, we already saw that as soon as a cube's vanishing point leaves dead center on the screen, it has to gain another vanishing point if we're going to be drawing in any kind of realistic scenario. So actually this drawing, if we're assuming that these horizontal and vertical front faces of this box are completely horizontal and completely vertical, would be impossible in real life. This cube would have to gain a second vanishing point as soon as one of its vanishing points leaves dead center. Again, to reiterate, what we're duplicating is this right here. Right, we're saying that that 1-point perspective is now off center, but what happened to the other vanishing points? Well, they have to start coming into the scene slowly as soon as that single vanishing point comes off center. So instead of this, what we would be looking for is something that would look like this. We would have to, get another vanishing point out here. So let's just start doing something like this. And again, let's use our perspective grid here. Our perspective tool, because it's just going to make things a little easier. So I'm going to do 1, 2, and then let's just set our second one out here and right there. So again, our 1-point perspective is off center, rotating things right to the right. We're bringing a second vanishing point in, and now I can go ahead and use what I thought was a 1-point perspective, but is really a 2-point perspective image. Now, if we go to some of our examples that are photographs, we can see that this really is the case with a true 1-point perspective image. This, I would venture to say, is right in the horizontal center of our composition. So we are getting a sense that everything, all of our horizontals and verticals are going to be straight up and down, because our vanishing point is right in the center. But if this camera started just rotated a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, or if we moved our whole city to the right or to the left, this vanishing point would start to veer off to the right. Okay, and what would start happening, so let's do that. Let's just take this and we're gonna rotate our camera to, that would be rotating our camera to the left, right? So this rotates to the right. We would be forced to add a second vanishing point. It'd be super far away for sure. Snap that there. Straighten this up again. Okay, something like that. And now, if we can imagine these buildings now, either the whole city rotating to the right or our camera rotating to the left, we would start to get buildings that look like this in space. Right, because now we're rotating to the left. And now, we wouldn't see the front faces of these anymore. Now you can see here that I'm having a hard time getting that horizontal angle of like what this building would start looking like as it was tipping. And that's because if I'm only just moving this right vanishing point 1 degree, this left one is far too close to the picture plane. In real life, it would be way off to the side. So let's do that again. So let's grab that perspective ruler, make that selection, and let's just kick that way out into the distance. Right, so if we kind of zoom out, that left vanishing point's way, way out there. So let's go ahead and draw that again. So we're drawing this here. That would be way out there. Now we're starting to see a little more angle on these buildings. Right, and in these, we would see less of those faces. So we'd see that like this, and then this building will start to rotate around. Right. Something like that. So now we're just rotating in that scene. So what do we learn from this section? Is that our vanishing points, which describe 90-degree angles of a box, are also describing a field of view of our image. Is this a narrow field of view where we're seeing even less than those 90 degrees, certainly less than 180? Or is it a wide field of view where we're seeing a lot of that 90 degree, even approaching 180 or more in our scene? We also discovered that 1-point perspective has a very small circumstance, and it's only when one of the vanishing points is in the horizontal center of our picture plane. As soon as that object rotates or our camera turns its head and that 1-point perspective veers off to the left or to the right, we're forced to add a second vanishing point, which has now come into the scene. And this now leads us to our third point, is that almost every scene should have a vertical vanishing point. Let's see what that means. Okay, that was a lot of information to digest if we're new to perspective, but don't be overwhelmed. The good news is that perspective isn't subjective. It either is or it isn't right. And we can use all the tools at our disposal to correct any drawing that we make. So let's go through 3 simple exercises to apply the 4 principles that we just talked about. And we're just going to start with something simple like a bed. It's a simple shape, it's based on a cube, and it's one we understand well. The first method we're going to do is to take a perspective grid and just use it to explore within our picture frame and just start drawing some shapes. So let's head on over to my website at rubenlara.com/perspective grid, and you can use any perspective grid that you have at hand, but this is an easy one and it's free. So all I'm going to do is click the little camera icon, and that will generate a JPEG image. I'm going to right click, copy image, and we can bring that into our document. And you can do this in Photoshop as well. I'm going to hit Command V and paste it right in there. Now, just a little tip in Clip Studio is I'm going to right click this and say convert layer, and we're going to convert this into an image material layer and just call this grid. And this just turns it into a layer that can be resized up and down without losing resolution, kind of like Photoshop's Smart Objects. The next thing I'm going to do is put this inside of a folder. So we'll say create folder and insert layer, and give ourselves a new layer here for a picture plane, and we're ready to go. So we're just going to be doing some quick thumbnails here, so I'm not going to be doing anything super final or high resolution. We'll just get 2 or 3 on a page. Next, I'm going to grab my grid, and now I can resize it using the object tool. So we'll go ahead and just start sizing this down. Okay, so to apply one of the early principles that we talked about is that if our 2 vanishing points are close to the edge of the picture plane, then we're at or approaching a wide angle shot, right? Because we're seeing a lot of that 90 degrees or that 180 degrees for that matter. So let's not make it too wide, and we'll just put this right here at the edges. Now, we also remember another thing about our vertical vanishing point is that if it's at the top, right, it means that we're looking up. It means our horizon line is below the center of the picture plane. So let's just go ahead and set that way for this one. All right, let's make a new layer here for our bed. I take this and just lower this a little bit. And now I can just explore and see what's happening with this particular grid. So I can start doing something like that. Now this vanishing point is quite extreme, I think, for this particular grid. So I'm going to go back to my perspective grid and raise that vanishing point much further in the vertical position to get something a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to come here, come to the perspective grid, and all you need to do is drag this purple dot up, and you'll see it'll just start going higher and higher up into the above our grid. So we'll grab another one there, right click, and we'll say copy image. And let's just reset that here. I'm going to delete that layer, paste it, convert that into an image material layer, and now I can resize it without worrying about loss of resolution. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that again. And we'll do something about right there. Clear that layer, and let's see what this looks like. So you can see that finding the right grid sometimes is a little bit of a trial and error when you're starting with a grid. And that's one of the challenges with just dropping grids right onto your document, is you're kind of subject to whatever angle that grid started with. So this makes a little bit more sense to me. And again, we're just doing some rough drawings here. I'm going to rotate my canvas so I can get some nice, easy, straight lines here. And drop that pencil line just a little bit, okay? All right, and I can always use my shift key, right, to kind of find that straight line. And if my vanishing point is clearly visible to me, I can use it the other way, and then just go ahead and erase, what's out here. Okay, something like that. All right, looks good. And it means our headboard is going to be something up here, something that looks like this. Maybe our room is going to be, doing something that looks like this toward the back. Now we can start understanding a couple things about this particular wide angle grid. Is that if we want our bed to have somewhat, undistorted proportions, it means we have to use a smaller portion of that grid. If we make the bed any larger in the scene, let's see what happens. Let's say we wanted this larger. Okay, now we're dealing with something that looks like, in fact, I'm going to just go down to 10% here. Go back up to 90. So you see the larger the element we have in a wide angle grid, the more distortion we're going to be getting. As objects approach, or approach the camera angle. So something to note. And if this bed was, floating in the air, we'd have something that looked like this. right? Because this bed would be above the horizon line. Okay, so that's kind of the nature of that wide angle grid. Let's try this again, but with a different angle. So I'm just going to duplicate this. Duplicate layer. I'll give us a secondary one. Pop this over here. And we'll turn our previous grid off. Delete that. Go to my object tool and experiment with this again. Now this time, let's go ahead and open this grid up quite a bit. I'm just hitting the Option or Alt key to scale it around the center. And we'll just make sure that these vanishing points are well beyond our picture plane. And in this case, let's go ahead and look down on the scene, which means we need to flip our vanishing point. So I'm just going to say Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical. And now our vanishing point is below us, right? Because our horizon line is above the center. So we'll do something like that. And let's see what happens here. Drop that down just a little bit more. Now we're getting into much narrower variances in our angles, right? They're not as aggressive in relation to each other. Kind of sketch this out before we commit. Good. Popping up to 90 again, and then we can kind of just, establish the main shapes of this bed shape. Good. So there we go. So we can now start seeing the differences between that wide angle on the left, which created a lot of those more distorted cubic shapes, versus the narrow angle on the right, which is now giving us shapes that are less distorted and a little bit closer to what we might see in real life. Let's do one more of these. I'm going to duplicate that. I've set that to Command J as my shortcut. We'll turn off our previous grid for the second one. Pull this down here. And let's go ahead and like really look down on this bed here. So I'm going to take my object, and again we're looking down, right? So our horizon line is going way up in the scene, and you can already see with our little grid shapes how we're already starting to get a sense of what the tops of those cubic faces would be. All right, come in here and let's come down to a low opacity just so we can sketch out our initial shapes here. So I'm gonna do something like this, and just kind of, giving it my best guess here, but the guidelines are definitely helping me. Like that. Maybe it's like this, coming down. So our bed shape's kind of going off the picture plane here. And it's okay, I can move my bed down. I can either do that in the grid by redrawing it, or I can just grab both my drawing and the grid and start moving this down to the picture plane as well. And that's totally valid. Just so we know that when we move our image in the picture plane, we're retaining that same angle on the bed versus redrawing it lower in the grid. And let's see what that looks like. So I'll just grab a blue here. So if I draw it lower in the grid to get it in, we're actually going to be tipping more on top of it. Maybe something like that. And then I'll just go ahead and grab my black and just restate that. Good, so even though it's very subtle, by redrawing it on the grid, we're actually moving it in 3D space. So we're actually seeing a little more of that top and a little less of this front face. And you can even kind of get a sense of that when the bed was up here. You can see that this is, now tipping into space, so we're seeing less of that. So this is probably a nice little, angle from the ceiling looking down. And the good thing about all of these drawings now is we have a basis for any other story that we want to tell in the scene using our grid. So if we wanted to, draw somebody here listening to music, they've come home from school, what I would probably do is just draw myself out another little cube just so I can get a good sense of, where this person is in 3D space as I'm drawing them. And now this is really going to let me come in here and, draw these shapes. Oh, there's a pretty huge bed here, right? So let's do something a little bigger. Small backboard. But you can see that now as I'm kind of roughing out these anatomical shapes, I'm able to kind of use the intention of this grid, or use the grid to inform all the rest of my shapes. Even drawing this small little blue box here is helping me, get a sense of, whatever we wanted to do with this character. And again, I'm just drawing simple primitive shapes, cylinders. Some headphones on this person. Again, just super rough idea, right? But the basic primitive shapes in perspective are what we're focusing on here. So that's method one for exploring a scene. Okay, the second method for roughing out or concepting a scene is to start with another photo. And it doesn't have to be a photo that is exactly related to the subject that you're talking about. Let's see an example of that, and we'll head on over to our browser. And I just went into Google and typed buildings again. We'll just keep using buildings because they're square. But let's stick with this same bed concept, but we just have to use our imagination a little bit. Just because we're looking at buildings doesn't mean that that's what we're going to draw. We're just going to extract the perspective from this. This might be really helpful when you're not quite sure how to imagine or envision these different drastic perspective angles yet. But you can clearly see, for example, on something like this, right? Imagine that we were a little mouse looking up at the bed. Well, we can use this to extract the perspective for our concept work. Let's do that really, fun low angle here. Okay, this is a good one. Let's go ahead and copy this. Come over to Clip Studio Paint. I'm gonna remove the grid from the first one that we did, just so we don't get confused by the different grids. Let's go ahead and make ourselves another picture plane. Paste our image. Clip Studio always pastes on the top left in case you're zoomed in and you don't know where it is. All right, we'll do something like that. Drop this a little bit, and let's use our perspective tool to extract the grid from this now. First, I'm going to grab these two and just group them. Okay, perspective tool, and remember, we want to set our left, our right, and then our vertical. So we'll grab something like this and something like this. Nice strong lines here, 1 and 2. So that gave us our horizon line. So we're looking up. The horizon line is below the vertical center. And now we can go ahead and extract our verticals this way. Okay, so the vanishing points are pretty close to the edges of our picture plane. So this is a wide angle view, and it looks like it. We're getting a lot of that distortion. But this might be the wide angle view that a mouse sees at the foot of the bed if they're looking up and it appears to be a giant building. So let's go ahead and drag this right into our folder. And now we can get ourselves a new layer and start to draw right on this grid. Again, we don't even have to use this corner of the building as the corner of the bed. We've already extracted our grid, and now we can just play around with where we are in this scene. So let's just imagine now that the edge of the bed is like this, and we've gone all the way back here. There's the headboard that pulls all the way back. And if we wanted to know where that headboard landed on the other side that's obscured to us, we're just going to draw really lightly here. Go down to 10%. In fact, I can turn off my picture now. Draw that back, and we'll draw this all the way back. So there's our basic cube for the actual bed. We'll extend this up, and then we'll extend our headboard back. So that's basically the width of the headboard going all the way back. And if we wanted to draw a person on this, sitting down, right, the little mouse is looking up at the person, just so we can see them a little more. Let's just assuming they're on this side of the bed here. So I'm just going to go in and draw out that cube of what I think, how much space I think that person is occupying in the bed. So let's just do something like that. In fact, I'm going to do this in blue just so we can kind of differentiate it here. Go up to 40% there. Okay, so let's say I'm going to say this person is just taking up that much of the bed. So there's their space. Right, I'm just drawing straight cubes. I'm not saying that they're perfect squares, but they're rectangular shapes, right? So that's going to be basically where they're going to be sitting at. And now I can start drawing this person in. Now if I keep drawing, I'm going to be snapping to this grid. So I can just select this middle icon here. Same thing as doing a Command or Control 2 that flips that on and off. Again, it's the same thing as saying snap to special ruler. So I'm going to hit Command or Control 2, and now I can draw straight up in there. And so here I would just, again, use this perspective to draw out our person. Now I am rotating these shapes in space now, right? So this cube of the head is not following the grid. It's getting its own vanishing point. But I'm just doing it based on gut feeling. All right, so there's our extreme distorted angle based on a photograph that wasn't even of a bed, but it's something that we were able to extract, and most importantly, it's something that we can visualize. So it's really easy to now go down a list of photographs online, especially of buildings, and just have this huge variety of angles that we can apply to anything. I mean, this could be a bookshelf, right? We could be looking down at a dining room table here. So the important thing is not to be confused by the scale of the images that you're seeing. What we're looking to do is extract that perspective in our mind's eye and use it as a basis for whatever. So even though this is an aerial view of the city, it could be a bunch of penguins in the snow. So the two methods so far are starting with a perspective grid, starting with a photo to extract that perspective, and the last one is just to go straight up right into the drawing, guessing at the perspective, and then making corrections as we go along. So let's try that next. Coming back into Clip Studio, I'm going to go ahead and turn off our perspective grid for this one, give ourselves a new layer, and let's just go ahead and do a couple different drawings here. And this is more likely the method that you'll be using as you get better and better at perspective. For sure, there are times when a client may give you a photograph and say, this is exactly the angle I want. Well, now you have all the tools you need to go ahead and extract that. But more than likely, as you get more and more comfortable with how perspective works, you'll be able to just have gut feelings about what these angles are, making mistakes as you rough it out, but then correcting them with the tools. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to go ahead and give ourselves another layer, put these in a folder. It's always good just to stay as organized as you can. And now I'm going to go ahead and actually let's go ahead and give ourselves a little bit more space, and I'm going to duplicate that, and so we can do 4 at once here. Okay, so this will be our last method of just roughing something out. I like this method because it's not so constraining. It's a little more fluid. So I'm going to go start here and say, okay, I have this idea of, you know, this bed is kind of like this, something like this. And I say, okay, that bed is too square. Maybe it's a king size bed. Now let's change it. Something like that. And I'm maybe imagining the person kind of sitting in this little spot here. But in my mind, I'm remembering some general rules, right? These are heading off into a vanishing point. These are heading off into a rough vanishing point. And my verticals are heading off into a rough vanishing point down here. And the more you study cinematography, I know I certainly have a lot to learn about it, but you'll start to get a sense of how these different angles create different moods, right? So an angle coming from the top down is more of an omniscient view, or you're dominating the scene, versus looking up, where it's a more of a submissive rule. Anyway, there's lots of stuff online that talk about that. So make sure that while you're learning perspective, you get a good sense of how these angles are affecting everything. All right, so I'm doing something like this, and even though this is off the picture frame, right, I'm still getting this feeling, right? My verticals are going up because my two vanishing points are now below the horizon line is now below the center of the picture frame. So something like that, and maybe I'm gonna go super extreme here and do something like this, right? And sometimes I'll just go right off the edge here, just so I can get a sense of what's in frame in camera. And now this is definitely going to be, you know, we're going to kind of be looking at the person down like this. And oftentimes I'll just go ahead and if I get stuck with you know, the angle of somebody, give yourself a box in there. Oftentimes that box, that cube, is really going to just help you get a sense of what's happening, you know, in space. Right? Okay, so that's another one. And let's go ahead and do top down. Maybe someone's, you know, this is a very, could be like a little bit of an ominous angle here, looking right down. Now, I don't know if these are all converging at the bottom. I'm just exploring and having fun at this point. I will do corrections on these, you know, if an idea needs to be polished in some way. Another good example of just kind of laying down that footprint. How much of this bed do I want this person to occupy? And it's just a reminder to me of how, you know, shapes that start coming at me need to spread out in space. So maybe they're looking down this way. A big pillow here or something. Reading a book. I don't know what that is yet. Okay, something like that. All right. Let's do another one here that's totally different. Maybe we're way up in the corner here. All right, this is approaching a one-point perspective, but it's not in the center, so our right one has to come into play. So that's our other one coming this way. And clearly, our points are here and way off here, so our horizon line is up in the page. We're looking down. That means our verticals need to go down. And it's at a Dutch angle, so like something's off about, you know, the perspective is correct, but I'm talking about the tone. Like something crazy is about to happen. If we don't want that, we can easily just take this and, you know, kind of straighten this out. Again, our horizon line will be tilting to the right, but it is creating a little more stability in there. Oops, I actually do this right on top of my picture frame. So never mind about that. We'll just keep going with this. And again, our bed shape is this, we're implying the same size bed here, but now I'm drawing myself another cube here so that I can get a sense of how much foreshortening there might be, with my figure. Should have done that in blue. I like to have a bunch of colors up here in my Clip Studio palette, just to kind of, set different guideline colors for myself as I'm sketching through. Yeah, something like that. So now I have a better idea of even how these shoulders, and how the torso is going to recede in space. It's a reminder to me that it's doing that. Look, another phone. I don't even know what this character is yet. Let's tilt ahead a little bit. But you see these little cages are helping me just kind of rotate these forms in 3D space, just based on gut feeling. Super rough, but how helpful are these to a client or a director, or even to myself, to say, wow, I don't know, there's something about the first or the third or the fourth one. Another tip I always like to do with my clients is just a number stuff, right? If you're going to be working in a collaborative environment. So that way you can easily throw this to somebody and say, all right, let's talk about these. And now we have something concrete to say. In number 3, it feels this way, or in number 2, it feels this way. Now what we can do is take this and then use our perspective tools, whether that's a grid or using our snapping tools, to then refine that sketch into a polished image. So for example, let's say the client comes back and says, well, I really like number 2. Great. So what we're going to do is take this, and now we're taking this on to the next stage. We'll bring it into a new document. We'll make it bigger. And now we're kind of back at where we were, with our photographs. We're imagining that this sketch that we drew is like our photographic basis. We know how to extract a grid from this. This is a really good exercise too, because it helps me keep refining my rough stages into better and better perspective. Now I'm sure we're going to find some mistakes in here, but that's good. That's what using our tools or perspective tools are for. So I'm going to do my left and right vanishing points. 1, 2, and now we'll go up and up. Do something like that. Okay, let's get on a new layer here, and we'll make sure to get our picture plane again. Oh, that's interesting too. One thing I didn't mention about Clip Studio is that the marquee tools and the rectangle tools respect the perspective grid. So you see that it's actually asking me to pick a plane here. If I do a plane this way, it'll actually make that rectangle in that space, which is pretty cool. I don't want that, so I'm just gonna hit Command 2 or Control 2 to not snap to the grid. Oh, it looks like even that doesn't work. Something new for me. So I'm gonna turn that off. There we go. Turn that back on again, and go back to my rough pencil. Now I can start working out, my final image here. So hit Command 2 again to snap back, and now I can. So look how off I was on the top of that bed frame. If I had chosen, if I basically was going by the front of this bed as my vanishing point, then my backrest was way off. Do something like that. Kind of like the imaginary plane of the bed there. And likely what I would probably do here is just kind of trace out this whole, let's go back to blue here. Cage again, where my person was sitting, and just even correct that as much as I could. Okay, so now that I make that box, I'm thinking like, okay, the person, it's about a good space for that box, something like that. And I might go in here and start adding secondary elements like a nightstand. So let's say our nightstand was, kind of took up about this much space next to the bed, and now I can start kind of drawing out where those cubes are. Again, that's the back of the wall, right? Because that's the edge of the bed. We'll assume it's up against the wall. I'm going to come back up. That's the depth of that cabinet. That comes like this. There might be some drawers here. Let's make a space for this, maybe for a lamp. So I'm just going to use some of my, what I know about perspective to find a center line. So I'm going to just hit 30% there. So by Xing out one of the planes, I can hit dead center on that. So now I can find a center line for the middle of that of this bed table, and I could just really go on for days and just kind of start finding cubic shapes that are going to be the basis for a bunch of other things in my scene. Even if this is going to be a round lamp, I still want to just be able to find what those spaces are, and that's going to give me all the information I need to start drawing out these other shapes. Let's say there's a picture on the wall back there, and all right, this is the edge of my bed rest. That's my bed. So maybe there's another lamp right here. Let's make a cube here. This will be like a floor lamp. Center right there. Basic ideas. Maybe there's a door back here. So if I kind of follow out this bed, I can't remember the name, backrest, I guess. Follow that all the way back. Let's assume that's, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet tall. Then the door frame might be, somewhere out here. Door to the bedroom. And the ceiling, let's just say it's something like that. And maybe there's something else out here. Okay, so I'm going to turn my perspective grid off. And I'm actually going to turn this whole thing into a blue layer. Turn off my rough sketch. And now I have something that I can go by and just really freeform draw this illustration without the perspective grid. So I'm not super constrained by, all that perfection. So let's go ahead and do that. good to me. All right, guys, that is it for today. And I really want to encourage you to do this bed exercise I just demonstrated. And to recap, it's 3 phases. Try doing 2 or 3 scenes in each one of them. First, it was using a perspective grid, right? Resizing it and exploring different aspects of it to find either a wide angle or a narrow angle. The second way was to use a photograph that you like and extract a grid from it, and don't be thrown off by the contents or scale of that photo. Use your imagination. It's a great way to explore what happens in real life and then using that to your advantage when you're making concepts. And then the third and final way is to rough out a scene just using your intuition, your best guess of the perspective grid, and then using tools to correct and refine that. Most importantly, don't be afraid of perspective. On the contrary, once you gain control of it, you're gonna find you have much more confidence and fun in everything that you draw. All right, guys, I hope that was helpful. As always, have fun, and we'll see you on the next one.